Conventional investors are stuck in this little tiny corner of the marketplace. And unfortunately, just because all that is just pushed at us and we seem to come out of the womb thinking that's all there is, that's all they know. And most people never, look beyond that unless there's somebody that gives them a little nudge or they hear something or read a book or listen to a podcast like this.
Hello and welcome everybody back to the Ideal Investor Show. I have an awesome guest today who I would say is descriptive and direct, and I like that a lot. At least that's from the title of his book that we will talk a little bit about, and his name is Chris Odegard. So Chris, thank you for coming and welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Axel. I'm glad to be here. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to just say that and then don't call it, but it's get off your ass and manage your money. That's actually a cool title.
Thank you.
And I'm saying this in similar or different versions to the folks that come to us for help with investing as well. It's only those who take action can actually expect to see any results. So Chris, Tell us a little bit about yourself. And I know about your story and the realizations and stuff, but it's always better when we hear it from you.
Yeah. Well, I was a corporate guy for most of my life. If anybody read Robert Kiyosaki's Cash Flow Quadrant, I was up there in the E quadrant because that's kind of the family I grew up in, and that's what I knew. And I invested for my financial independence and retirement through employer 401ks. And I was on what I call the 401k to mediocrity with retirement. They're so far in the distance that I needed a telescope just to see it.
Right.
And then in 2009, I was in my mid 40s and I had a huge illiquidity event where I lost 55% of all my assets. In my case, it was a divorce, but it could have been anything. And coincidentally, around that time, a friend of mine said, "Hey, Chris, you got to read this book. You got to read this book." And so I bought this book and I set it off on the shelf and it sat there for too long. And I finally picked it up and I read it. And of course, it was Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And like millions of others, my mind was open to a whole different way of investing and thinking about money. And so I kind of switched from conventional investing to alternatives, primarily real estate. And over the next 9 years, I made that 55% deficit and multiplied it many times over. And what I like to say, fired the man, and I never have to work again if I don't want to, which I think is where we all want to be, right? Work should be a choice instead of a necessity. But
exactly. Well, and I mean, when I read your bio and Nadine, who is the little elf in the background who's making all this happen, told me about it, I was like, oh, Chris is really in a similar vein and may even have had a similar journey. I mean, for me, the trigger point was not so much the Kiyosaki book. It was more, I retired from the Air Force right around 2001 when the dot-com bubble burst. Shortly after, I wanted to get and start my own business because I thought, well, that's my second life, my second career is having my own business. And started looking around, okay, so when you have a business, how do you ever retire? And because of that crash of the stock market, that was kind of out of the question for me. And I was like, okay, well, what could it be? And I ended up very slowly getting myself into real estate. And as I kept telling people about it, they kept encouraging me to make it more official, as they call it.
Yeah, right.
Like get a website and get this and then a YouTube channel. And here we are on the Ideal Investor Show with Chris. So it's really cool. Now, when I read a little bit about things that you're doing, you talk about alternative investing. Can you tell us a little bit what you mean by alternative investing?
Yeah, so the world is really divided up into two categories, conventional investments and alternatives. And it's really easy because conventional investments are pretty much everything that's publicly traded, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs. Everything else is alternatives. And then there's really four asset classes. So there's paper and commodities, real assets, and businesses, private shares of small businesses. And when I find this funny, if you go to a financial planner and they're going to build you a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, you're in one asset class, the paper asset class. So you're not diversified at all.
Yeah, exactly.
So everything that's not publicly traded is alternatives. And that includes, every type of real estate. If you have a small business, cash value life insurance, believe it or not, ATM machines, Bitcoin and commodities and all that kind of stuff. So conventional investors are stuck in this this little tiny corner of the marketplace. And unfortunately, just because all that is just pushed at us and we seem to come out of the womb thinking that's all there is, that's all they know. And most people never, look beyond that unless there's somebody who gives them a little nudge or they hear something or read a book or listen to a podcast like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a brilliant description. Thank you for that, Chris. And the other part or the additional part that I see is it's kind of interesting to me that when you open ears and eyes into this massive universe of information and what they call news, we hear about that one asset class and all its different variants and
Right.
how some undeserving person got rich beyond anybody's imagination and stuff like that by either having a business or having stocks that actually represent the value of the business. But unless you kind of interested or you really found for yourself by maybe reading Kiyosaki books or you went on YouTube and literally put in like passive income or real estate investing, that area that you and I and a couple of our close friends, couple hundred I was about to say, our
Yeah.
close friends are investing, it's not really very noisy, right? I mean, the
No,
only
no.
thing with the Corona thing, we had this eviction thing, but even that, it never really felt to me that people really wanted to understand what's going
Right.
on other than the
Right.
poor tenant that needs to
Yeah.
be protected. So do you have any kind of idea why this really important? I mean, even distinction to say it shouldn't just necessarily or doesn't have to only be real estate, but why is nobody really talking about the alternative investments?
Well, there's a couple reasons. One is that conventional investments are easy. Number one. So if you join a company today and they have a 401k, they will automatically opt you in, pick the amount of your paycheck that gets deducted for the 401k, and actually pick the basket of mutual funds you invest in. And so it requires no financial education and no effort on your part. And think about trying to get financing for a piece of real estate. If you walk into a banker and you have no knowledge of anything, you're never going to get there. I have a friend who's kind of a conventional financial planner and insurance kind of guy. And I asked him, I said, why is it that I cannot find an advisor that will advise me on alternatives? And he said, there's two reasons. He said, one, because the conventional investments are a steady stream of automated income. Once you get that money that's assets under management, the money just keeps rolling into these advisors and they do. So basically he's saying it's easy money. And then the other thing he said was that a financial advisor can never be sued for recommending a conventional investment to you. It's publicly traded. It's been vetted by the SEC. But if they recommend some private placement fund to me and it ends up being a Ponzi scam, they could be liable. So between that and then just the fact that what I would call what you were talking about, the mainstream media, where a lot of people get all their information. The syndicators of the world aren't advertising on Fox News and CNN and MSNBC. All you see is the Schwabs and the Fidelities and those big guys. So between the culture that we grew up in and all the advertising, but I think it's slowly changing because there's so much information out there, and anybody with a computer, if you want to get a message out, you've got a platform. So I think it's changing, but it's not going to change overnight.
No, absolutely. I agree with you. And the part why we have the Ideal Investor Show, why we're inviting you and have a conversation is I really firmly believe that we are in many ways in a transitory time.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan. I don't know if you ever heard about the book, The Fourth Turning, which,
I have, yeah.
that's for anybody listening to both of us today, I can only highly recommend it because it really looks at the cycles of the economy and the cycles of history in a bigger scheme. And I believe we are at the fourth turning. And fourth, basically, for those who haven't ever heard about it, the idea is think about the seasons of the year, right? Like you start out with winter, then spring, then summer, then fall. And like it is with, agriculture or your trees in the backyard and so forth, when fall comes to an end and we go in the winter time, everything goes dormant and waits for renewal. And it feels like we are kind of, this is not just because of Game of Thrones, right? Like winter has
Yeah.
started. We are literally in winter right now, but it's also in the
Right.
big cycles, I believe, currently going through the winter time to renew and replenish, but also to say, what will the new version of what comes out look like?
Right.
And a lot of the things, I've said to this traditional asset class that you said, well, and I just wrote it for our next blog post, what goes up at some point has to come down. And we had
Right.
12 years of stock market rise, and there are so many people who listen to what you were just describing, the traditional media, not necessarily even making the connection that every time they hear that the stock market went up or somebody complaining about a person who got rich in the stock market, that also means the risk of exposure of their money sitting in those 401k plans that they don't even have to
Right.
think about, as you said, Chris.
Right.
When that coming down starts, it means coming down of their money that they park there as well.
Right.
And I always find it interesting. I wonder what you would say about this when in the context of where you say, manage your money, that people have a hard time understanding if something, there is a correction, and let's just say it's not really a massive 55% correction. Let's say it's just a 30% correction. But what people don't understand, if something is currently like a stock is, let's say $60 a share, a 30% correction means it loses $20 of its value. Now it's 40. To get back to 60, it has to double. It
Yeah.
has to
Right.
increase by 50% increase to get to your old thing. And if you say, okay, now I'm 55 years old or whatever in my 50s, I
Yeah.
want to
You're never going to get
retire
there.
in a foreseeable future. How long is it going to take after all the turmoil is over for a 50% increase when the average is 7?
Right.
But the
Yeah.
average of the S&P 500 is somewhere in the 7% area. So if you need 50% just to get where you are right now, that
Yeah.
means 7 years. And a lot of people might be surprised to hear, well, can you really do that? I'm like you. I mean, that's why I said we are very well aligned. I have only one stock, not going to say which one, but I have one stock. Everything else is in alternative assets.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit, do you favor any one of those alternative assets over the other? And if so, why? Or how would you basically say without, we're both not financial advisors, not tax
Right.
advisors, not
Yep.
CPAs, but when we just voicing our opinions, what would you say in the alternative space?
Yeah.
Is there anything you favor, anything that you would
Yeah.
recommend?
Well, I like multifamily. I like apartment buildings. And these days I invest in syndications as a limited partner. I get really good returns and I don't have to do a whole lot of work. So I like that. When you invest in stocks or even if you're in alternatives, investing in private shares of small business, when I look at apartment buildings, I go, there's no technology on the horizon that's going to make obsolete people's need to come home at the end of the day and have a place to sleep and eat and spend time with their family. So technology is not going to ruin that investment. And I watch this stuff all the time. There's still a housing shortage in the country
Yeah.
in terms of apartment buildings and single family rentals. And that's not going to turn around overnight. And the other thing I saw recently is that the pendulum is swinging again. We're going from a home ownership nation to a home renter nation again. And the rents on apartments are just going up at rates that people who have been in the industry for 30 years have never seen before.
I see that the same way, and I really like to second that. And on the other hand, I have to say it's not really that surprising because a few years ago, you could probably have said people in the industry have not seen the appreciation almost across all markets that we've seen in real estate, and rents typically seem to lag a little bit behind by a year or two. So I think the rents are catching up, and they're catching up at a time where we have 7% inflation. So they have to catch up even more,
Right.
in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I was about to interrupt you and say, Chris, are you actually saying the three basic things that Maslow said, like safety, food, and shelter, will still be
Yeah.
needed in the future?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and unfortunately, on one hand, I feel bad if you're a renter, this is a bad situation for you, right? But everybody has a choice, and smart investors make money in both markets, up markets and down markets, because they look at what's coming and they pivot and switch from, this is not working anymore, let's go over here. So at some point in time, if apartment buildings aren't working anymore, there will be something else that is, and the smart investors will move and make money again at a different time in a different market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm trying to get across for our audience and for people who come to me for like a free strategy call or join our mentoring program that there is really not so much, and I try to get them to understand, don't focus so much on price and appreciation and focus way more on performance. And so in the context of what you were just saying, I oftentimes try to get across to people to say, okay, in a sense, if you really want to be an investor, you want to take a look at what is the circumstance and who is better off. And what I mean by that is if you said right now you're in Seattle because you had a particular need to take care of in the area, and that is known to be and has become a really expensive market, right? So it's not very hard to find reasonable house, as far as like something 3 bedroom, 2 bath house or something like that costs $1 million, right? So if I say, okay, well, let's as investors look at performance and we want to be anywhere between 0.8 and 1%, that would mean if you, Chris, were the tenant in that house, you would have to pay $8,000 to $10,000 a month, which is probably not going to happen. It's much more likely that it's somewhere between 3,400 to maybe 4,500. So that means on that $1 million house, you get 0.35, 0.4%. I would say the tenant wins. Now, if I take that same scenario and say I get myself 5 $200,000 houses somewhere where I can expect to make, let's say, $1,700, $1,800 rents for a $200,000 house, which is in that
Right.
0.8 area, and I add that together, then my rent is in the area of $7,000, $8,000, and now I'm in that ballpark. Then I would say if those 5 houses are my houses, I win as the investor, right? So it's a matter of how do I create an investment, not just by type, but also by performance, that actually performs well for me by playing with all the different variables. And in that sense, it's true across all these alternative investments to look. Some people like me, I love residential because I understand it. It's the same like I started with my first own residence that I got, and my duplex, triplex, fourplex, single family, they all work basically the same. The same rules for lending, the same rules for application, for appraisal and stuff. Does that mean that there's anything wrong with syndication or apartments? No, not at all. It's just a different variant, right? Some people like beer, some people like wine, in a sense, or great beverages. Others
Don't leave out bourbon.
bourbon. I was just about to say, some are whiskey and some are tequila drinkers. And we
I
can,
think that's 3 main food groups, right? Beer, bourbon, and wine.
exactly. Well, since we cover Maslow today and we wanted to do shelter and food, right? I did my security part with 22 years Air Force, so we're all covered, Chris. We're good to go.
Okay, good deal, good deal. When you were talking about the stock market and the guy losing 20% of his value on that $60 stock or whatever, if that person had been invested in real estate, what I've seen through my investing in real estate for the years is the values, just like this. So as long as you've got a cash flowing real estate investment, the real estate guy, I heard one of those guys speak one time at an event, and he said, the value of your property only matters 2 times in its life, when you buy it and when you sell it.
Yeah.
At all the other times, I had a condo rental here in Seattle that I bought at the height of the market at the end of 2007, and it lost 50% of its value during the downturn. But guess what the rents did? They just kept going like this.
Yeah.
And as long as I didn't need to sell that property during that time, I waited it out till the market had recovered and sold it for more than I paid for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a beautiful example. And I think it reiterates my point about performance, right? You need to find an asset like, for example, a house or an apartment complex where you have a reasonable expectation that it will perform well at that point of purchase. And then the performance is completely irrelevant on the value of the asset itself. Right. It's how you actually operate it. In that sense, I find it would be really helpful if more people would kind of draw analogies to how a regular business works. If you make a product, the more efficient you can run your operations, the more efficient you can run your machineries, the more efficient you can source your resources to ultimately make the product. It is obvious pretty much to everybody that you will make most likely a cheaper product that can then generate more profit when you sell it. And that's in a sense the same thing. If we have a good asset that is either well renovated or well built, and we just reasonably get performance through the rent, we are all good. Now, the one thing that I think is important, and I wonder what you say about, because there's some people that are a little bit on the fence. I'm a huge fan of using leverage in a multifamily apartment environment. You're almost forced to do it. But I always say, when people say the normal market, right, like the non-alternative market, well, if you want to own $100,000, pick a name of company, you have to literally give them $100,000 to get that amount of ownership or shares or stock.
Right.
If I want to own $100,000 worth of real estate, I only need to give them $20,000, right? And the rest comes from the bank, and the tenant that is part of the performance pays for it. So tell us a little bit, because that's not my area in multifamily or syndication, how leverage plays a role.
You can't get rich without leverage. That's the bottom line. You got to use leverage. And why wouldn't you? I wrote an article on my blog at theprolificinvestor.net because I was sitting around thinking and I thought, intuitively that I know that a single family rental is a better investment than a 401k. But I thought, you know what? I've never done the numbers, so I don't really know if it's true, but I think it's true.
Hmm.
So I took, and I don't have the numbers memorized, but I took a person and I said, so let's say they take 30,000, no, they would take $100,000 and put it into their 401k with the average match, and they would get your 8% return in the S&P 500 over some period of time. And then a real estate investor would buy a $100,000 single family rental, but he would only put in $30,000 cash because he would get the leverage. So,
Yeah.
and then I had some very conservative numbers for cash flow and appreciation, and the single family rental outpaced it the first year and every year beyond. The big draws of the 401k is two things: the company match and the deferral of taxes. So when you think about it, real estate has the same two things. You get a company match, but it's in the form of a tenant paying off your loan for the next 30 years.
Yeah.
And you get that every year, not just the year that you make your initial investment, like the 401k. Every month, they're putting in their money and paying off your loan. That's the company contribution kind of analogy. And then the other thing, the tax break, you get something called depreciation, not just the year you make your investment, but for the next 26 and a half years. And that just compared making this investment one time. Well, if every 3 or 4 years you bought another single family rental, it just ramps up. So you have to use leverage. And when I tell people, if I knew what I knew way back when, I would have never put a dime in a 401k. They go, oh, but the match and the taxes, you can get better than that outside of the 401k.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I find interesting, right? Like if you were to say, okay, what is my income going to be when I
Mm-hmm.
retire? Let's say you were super, super smart and you do what you just described, Chris, somewhere in your 30s. And
Mm-hmm.
you do the whole traditional thing and decide you retire at 65 or somewhere in
Yep.
the early 60s. So you had 30
Right.
years to do it, right? You do that contribution not just one time, but you would basically use the same amount of money over time to invest in real estate. You could literally say, I basically have my income plus I retain the assets plus I have all the tax benefits that I had. And if I
Mm-hmm.
ever wanted to change something, I have the freedom to do. I could even forego Social Security and still be better off versus the situation with the 401k. Even if everything works out perfectly, you never have a major market crash or stuff like that, which
Mm-hmm.
is unlikely in a 30-year period. You have probably at
Right.
least 3 or 4 of those crashes.
Yep.
But
Right.
let's assume you were the lucky one in 30 years who never had that happen. You still have to start eating into what you have accumulated to be able to
Yep.
have any kind of retirement pay versus
Yep.
your properties after 30 years are all going to be paid or most of them going to be paid. And on
Mm-hmm.
every single one, you make the full rental income more or
Right.
less in your pocket, except for property taxes and insurance. So it's not even fair. I mean, it's
Yeah.
percentage wise, it's not fair. On the
No.
numbers, on the asset value, it's not
Yeah.
fair because there's no chance that you can overcome 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 leverage versus somebody
Yeah.
who has to put literally 1-to-1 money in. It's just not a fair competition.
Yeah.
So these things, it's really, in a sense, I'm glad that we are basically agreeing and that we are also living examples of actually doing it, because only when we put the information like this out and talk about it and provide proof, I think more and more people will realize, well, if I'm just drinking the Kool-Aid, I'm probably going to get the results of somebody who constantly drinks Kool-Aid rather than
Right.
have a healthy diet and then also have healthy
Yeah.
returns at the end.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, the conventional investors, the question that they're typically asked is like, what size portfolio do I need to retire? Going to your thing,
Yeah, yeah.
because if you're just building this mountain of a balance sheet, not cash flow, you're just building this mountain of money. Then when you retire, you have to chip away and sell a little bit of it every month to pay your bills. People say, well, how big does that mountain need to be? And I think that's certainly the wrong question. The right question is, what do I want my income to be in
Right.
retirement? So I'm going to pick $65,000 is about the median income in the United States today. And if you said, well, I want to have a $65,000 annual income when I retire, and then you use something called the 4% rule, that's the amount of that portfolio you can sell off annually and not run out of money. Except the 4% rule isn't working anymore. It's now the 3% rule,
Right.
or the 3-something percent rule. That means you have to have a multi-million-dollar 401k portfolio, and only 8% of Americans will ever be millionaires. So what it all says is this whole system of conventional investing and 401ks doesn't work for 92% of the population. They're never going to get there comfortably. They're going to have to work longer or reduce their lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally with you. And one thing I like to maybe add to this is I'm actually a fan of the FIRE movement, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
this financial independence, retire early. I think the mechanism, the habits, the ideas that they have are great. The only thing that really sucks about it is that they're in the wrong asset class, right? If they were to apply everything they say about the FIRE movement and what you should do and so forth, the only difference between what you and I say and what they say is they're going to get to what I call the time freedom point earlier because they live super frugal, which I have never done. But if you were to
Okay.
do it, it only shortens the amount of time that you need to invest. But if you invest
Yeah.
in assets with leverage like you and I do, they would be done way earlier and they would never have to think about 3% or 4% or taking anything away or any of that stuff.
So I didn't know that. Is the FIRE movement still on the conventional side? Are they still using stock,
Yeah, they
bonds, mutual
basically
funds?
say go with
Oh,
like Vanguard or something like that. That is
okay.
basically
Yeah.
non-managed, broad spectrum mutual funds to. But the thing I believe the FIRE movement's main point is the message that if I had to say what's the message of the FIRE movement is understand how money works so that you are willing to be frugal with your expenses or your consumption and you can put as much as possible, as early as possible into your investments. And I think that part is great. And then you and I would say, and make these investments leveraged alternative assets, and you will be done so much earlier
Yeah.
than the fire guys,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I think you said what the average of the S&P 500 is 8%
It's
or
about
something like that.
a little more than 7%. Yeah.
Okay, and guys like us routinely make 15 to 30% annual returns
Yeah, if you
in,
take
in,
the
in
tax
real in real
advantage and the
estate.
leverage and everything. I mean, there are so many cool things, right? I always say when people ask me, can you give me an example how that works, right? I say, well, let's take the $150,000 house. You put $30,000 in, your 20%, you get the other 80% from the bank. And last year, I'm not making it up, you can go anywhere, pretty much the place is appreciated 10%, right?
Oh yeah.
Just for that simple example, because it
Mhm.
is a little more related to stocks going up by 10%. So on the $150,000 house, that's $15,000. Guess how much that is on the 30,000 you put in? You just made 50% on your money. Show
Exactly.
me any
Right.
stock market that
Yeah.
ever makes 50%.
Right.
And now I'm also going to file a tax return that gives me depreciation on top of
Hmm.
my 50% return. Are you
Yep.
kidding me?
Right.
And
Yep.
then all the costs I had with this thing were paid by the tenant, and I had
Hmm.
$250 left times
Yeah.
12. That's $3,000 on top of the 15,000. So in
Yeah.
reality, I'm at 18,000.
Right.
Then you basically mind blown, right? Like,
Yeah.
how the heck is
Right.
that possible? But more
Yeah.
importantly, and that's actually the encouraging thing, more and more times people come and say, I never realized how this really works. And when we put it
Hmm.
into these like 2 minute, relatively easy
Yeah.
examples, how much your money can actually do, especially when you
Right.
say, how hard I have to work to make it. Now, why shouldn't it then actually perform well for me when I invest it? And that's really something that we need. I'm so glad that you're here to help me with that, get the message out. These alternatives should become the norm.
Yeah. And I don't even like calling them alternatives, but when I started my blog in 2018 and I was trying to identify what it is that I'm doing, it's the term that they use. I said, okay, I'm an alternative investment blogger, even though I think it's ridiculous that these are alternatives instead of mainstream, but that's the terminology we have. So I said, okay, I'll use what the industry's
Yeah,
using.
sometimes
So,
it's a little weird, right? Like when you ask yourself, why is our whole spiel around everything has the word ideal in it, right? And
mhm,
basically, the way that happened is I put together, like, what are all the things that we're going to address? Like, we want to have equity and we want to have leverage and we want to have these different terms, income and
mhm.
appreciation. And so I had these terms, and then there is a
Got to be
tool.
dead in there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and so yeah, that's leverage basically, right? And
Okay,
so
gotcha.
so I there's a tool online, and you can basically throw a bunch of words in, and it tries to make words out of it. And the only
Okay.
word that made any sense was ideal, right?
Yep.
And so
Okay.
so
So
then
what's it stand for?
well, it stands for. income is for the I, the D
Yep.
is for depreciation, the E
Okay.
stands for equity, the A stands for appreciation, and the L stands for leverage.
Perfect.
Right.
That's
So those
awesome.
are all the things that you do basically with residential real estate asset. And that was
Yeah.
they put it in different combination. None of the other things made any kind of like something that you could use. So it's,
Yeah.
ideal. I can handle that. Right. And so it
There you
became
go.
the ideal wealth grower and the ideal investor show and so forth. So
Nice.
yeah, sometimes it just happens that way.
Yep.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time together, and we always use a couple of questions for our guests to answer so that we have some continuity. So I want to use two of our questions. The first one is, if you could meet anybody currently alive or deceased, who would that be and why would you want to meet them?
Abraham Lincoln.
Okay, and why?
Just because he was such an incredible guy and and maneuvered the country through one of the most difficult times. He's just a fascinating character for me, and I would just love to have dinner with him and a beer, bourbon, or wine, whatever his preference was, and talk about his thoughts about all the things that were happening during the Civil War.
Yeah, and then you would tell him not to go to hold that speech, right?
Yeah. don't go to Taft Theater. Is that no Ford Theater?
Yeah, some theater,
Yeah,
I know.
Ford Theater.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, cool. And then the other question is, if you had a time machine and you had freedom to go forward, backward, where would you go and why?
I'm kind of nostalgic about a simpler time of life, and
Okay.
I think I should have been born around my dad's time, like in the late 30s, early 40s, where, I love the 50s rock and roll and all the car styles back then and
Yeah.
the music and the way people dressed. And so I think it'd be fun to go back and kind of visit that era.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds interesting. And I like the music too. Although I wonder if the people, if you were to meet them, would actually call it easy times, right?
Yeah, no, it's all right?
Well,
Well, I'd say simpler times. Seemed like they were simpler
yeah,
times. I don't know if
simpler
they were easier.
times. I think everybody in their time finds their life to be relatively complex or getting more and more
Mhm.
complicated. And then you say, well, you have no idea what happens in 20 years from now, right? Like, and I'm sure
Right.
our kids would say the same thing about us, to say, well, when I'm getting to your age, the times will be way more complex and blah.
Yeah, right.
Okay, very cool. So, Chris, again, thank you for being here, but I want to give you a chance. How can people kind of find you, can engage with you, can learn from you?
Yeah, if you go to my website, theprolificinvestor.net, all the social media channels are there. YouTube is there. I typically write an article once a month about alternative investments or some aspect of personal finance. I have a conventional wisdom quiz, so you can go on there and take the conventional wisdom quiz. It's tricky, and there's 10 questions to answer them, and I'll give you my answers and tell you whether you were right or wrong. And there's a little coffee cup on there, and people can schedule a virtual 30-minute coffee with me to talk about anything related to finance investing. And also there's a big flashing star there for my recently released book, Get Off Your Ass and Manage Your Money, Why You Need Alternative Investments. And you can get to a link to Amazon from there, or if you go to Amazon, the best way to find it is just to type in my name, Chris Odegard, and that'll bring it up really quick. So yeah, everything's at theprolificinvestor.net. Love to hear from people.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's awesome. And all the things that you just said, we will put in the show notes. So when the show comes out, that people can actually find it and click the links and search for the book. One thing I want to help Chris out is it's always helpful for books when you leave actually a response, like a little bit of a review on Amazon. So
Yeah.
don't just get it and read it, but go back later and say, hey, Chris, this was awesome because
Yep.
it's.
Yeah, that's true. Appreciate that. Yeah, that's very important.
Okay, cool. Well, with that, I hope we covered all the bases. Chris, I want to, for one, thank you again that you were here. I hope that you're healing very well and very quickly. And maybe we do it again sometime in the future.
Anytime. Absolutely.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Ideal Investor Show. More info and the links we mentioned during the show are in the show notes, or you can go to our website at idealwealthgrower.com and sign up for the Apple Podcast link. And if you like to talk to me, sign up for a strategy call. Hopefully you want to share what you learned with your network and bring more people in. We are really eager to hear your comments. And until next time, be well, stay safe, and ciao.